My husband said, I sold your little lake for $70,000. His smirk crept across the table like oil on still water. He looked me dead in the eyes and added, the money for this dinner is from the lake sale. At least one meal is covered. The waiter chuckled. I didn't. Hi everyone, my name is Eloan Hart, I'm 35. And that was the moment I realized some betrayals don't scream, they whisper over candlelight, wearing perfume and polite laughter. That lake wasn't just water. It was the one thing in this world that was mine. My father had left it to me before he died, a quiet blue stretch surrounded by birch trees and wind that smelled like pine and rain. When the world got too loud, I'd sit there barefoot, letting the ripples carry my thoughts. It was my stillness, my inheritance, my truth. And now, he'd sold it. I looked at him across the table. His tie was loosened, eyes glassy with pride. You should thank me, he said. It was wasting away. I turned sentiment into profit. Profit. That was his religion. I tried to speak but couldn't. My throat felt like gravel. He raised his glass toward me, grinning. To smart moves and clean slates. Clean slates. I wondered if betrayal always sounded this casual. Then his phone rang. He ignored it. Rang again. And again. Finally, with a sigh, he answered, putting it on speaker without care. A man's voice burst out, frantic and furious. Why are the authorities at our office? What did you sell us? The restaurant seemed to stop breathing. My husband's face drained of color. What? He stammered. What are you talking about? But the line had already gone dead. He turned to me, voice cracking with something that almost sounded like fear. What did you do, Eloan? I folded my napkin carefully, smoothing every crease like a goodbye. I didn't answer him. I just watched the candle burn lower, slow, steady, unflinching. Because some fires don't start with matches. They start with silence. The flame between us quivered as if it could sense the shift. My husband's hand shook when he reached for his glass, the first sign that his confidence had cracked. Don't look at me like that, he muttered. You've always been dramatic. I sold the land legally. He said it like he needed to hear it himself. I tilted my head, studying him the way you'd study a stranger who accidentally wore your husband's face. Did you check whose name was on the boundary file? I asked softly. He frowned. It was in mine. You signed the transfer years ago. A lie, rehearsed and smooth. But before I could respond, the sound of sirens bled through the restaurant's soft jazz, distant, then closer. Heads turned. Forks froze mid-air. My husband's eyes darted toward the window. Red and blue lights spilled against the glass, painting our reflections in flashing gilt. He stood up too fast, his chair scraping the marble. Eloan, what did you do? I stayed seated. Nothing, I said quietly. I just stopped pretending not to see what you did. Two men in dark coats entered. The hostess tried to intercept them, but one flashed a badge. Mr. Hart, the taller one called. We need to ask you a few questions about a fraudulent land sale. Every eye in the restaurant swung toward us. My husband stammered, there must be a mistake. But his voice broke when the officer said, the environmental authority reported the property is protected wetland. You sold restricted land under false ownership. Silence. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. He turned to me, realization dawning, not that I'd called them, but that I'd known. He whispered, you set me up. I leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. No. You walked into it. The officers took him outside as the candle finally died, its smoke curling like a sigh between us. And just like that, the man who sold my piece lost his own. The restaurant door swung shut behind him, leaving a silence that hummed louder than the sirens outside. People whispered, some pretending not to look, others savoring the scandal. I stayed seated, tracing my finger along the rim of the untouched wine glass. It trembled, just slightly, not from fear, but from release. By the time I stepped into the night, he was already in the back of a black sedan, flashing lights washing over his pale face. Our eyes met through the glass, his full of panic, mine full of quiet truth. He mouthed, why? I didn't answer. Because he didn't deserve to know yet. When I got home, the house felt hollow. His jacket hung by the door like a ghost still pretending to live here. I walked to the study, his sacred place of business, and opened the drawer he always kept locked. The key had been easy to find, taped under his desk, right where he thought I'd never look. Inside were copies of the sale documents, contracts, and one old manila folder marked in my father's handwriting. I froze. It wasn't just the lake deed. It was a sealed letter, brittle from age, with my name on it, Eloan Hart, formerly Eloan Ainsley, and a blue wax seal bearing my father's initials. My hands shook as I broke it open. If you're reading this, Ellie, I'm gone. The lake isn't what it seems. Beneath it lies the archive, proof of what the old company did to this land. That's why they'll come for it. Protect it, my girl. It's yours, and it's worth more than gold. I stared at those words until they blurred. So that's why my husband wanted it. He didn't just sell my piece, he tried to sell my father's truth. The phone rang again. Unknown number. A familiar voice on the other end said, "Mrs. Hart, you might want to sit down. The buyer's not who you think." The line clicked dead. And just like that, the story of my father's lake had only begun to surface. I stood there with the phone still pressed to my ear, the silence humming like static. The buyer's not who you think. The words looped in my mind as I sank into the chair behind my husband's desk, his throne of deception, still smelling faintly of cologne and ego. The sale folder lay open before me, and I scanned the signatures carefully. My husband's was there, bold, arrogant, and beside it, the buyer's, are Alden and Associates. The name tugged at a memory. Alden. I pulled out my father's old journal from the box beneath the desk. He'd written about a man named Richard Alden, the industrial developer who'd tried to buy the lake 20 years ago. The same man whose company had dumped toxic waste into the valley streams and buried the evidence. The same man my father had spent the rest of his life trying to expose. And now my husband had sold him the land. The room tilted for a second. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was desecration. I flipped through the sale documents again. The transfer had been fast-tracked through a proxy firm. The notary's seal was recent, too recent. It was all clean, too clean. But buried in the pages, I found something, a small handwritten note in my husband's hurried scrawl. Deal final. Alden covers the debt plus bonus on delivery. Don't tell Eloan, she's attached. Attached. Like the lake was a trinket, not the pulse of my childhood. I felt something shift inside me, the ache turning into resolve. He wanted to profit from my silence. I would destroy him with it. I opened my laptop and searched our Alden environmental violations. Page after page of sealed court files, missing testimonies, and one familiar name surfaced, my father's. His last case before he died had been against Alden Industries. Suddenly, the puzzle locked into place. The lake wasn't a mistake, it was unfinished business. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and relentless, tapping the windows like a quiet countdown. And in that sound, I made a promise. I would finish what my father started. The rain thickened, blurring the world beyond the glass. It sounded like 1,000 whispers urging me on, each drop a heartbeat, each heartbeat a memory. I pulled my father's letter closer, reading it again. Beneath it lies the archive. Beneath the lake. The realization sank in slowly. Whatever my father had hidden wasn't just sentimental. It was evidence. Something powerful enough that even decades later, men like Alden still wanted it buried. I grabbed my coat and the old cabin keys, the ones I hadn't touched since the funeral. By the time I reached the lake, the rain had turned to mist. The world looked ghostly, silver fog curling over the water, reeds bending like they remembered me. The cabin stood quiet, windows glowing faintly from the lightning's reflection. I stepped inside, dust and cedar greeting me like an old friend. My father's fishing gear still hung on the wall. The clock still ticked, slow and deliberate, as if time had waited. I went to the floorboard he'd once called the lake's second mouth. It creaked under my weight, just like I remembered. I pried it open with a rusted screwdriver, and there it was, a steel lockbox wrapped in oilcloth, sealed and labeled Alden Case, 1998. My hands shook as I lifted it out. Inside were photos, documents, and tapes, evidence of chemical dumping, falsified reports, and bribed officials. My father had built the case of his life and hidden it beneath the lake when they threatened him. A flash of headlights outside cut through the fog. I froze. Someone was here. Through the window, I saw a black SUV idling near the dock, the same logo I'd seen on the sale contract, Alden and Associates. The engine cut. Doors opened. A man's voice called out, steady but sharp. "Eloan Hart? We know you're in there. Hand over what doesn't belong to you." I swallowed the tremor in my chest, slid the box into my coat, and whispered to the empty room. "It's exactly where it belongs." Then I blew out the lantern and stepped into the rain. The night swallowed sound. Rain hissed against the lake's surface like static, and the beam of a flashlight sliced through the mist, searching, hungry. I ducked behind the cabin's side wall, clutching the lockbox against my chest. The men's footsteps crunched closer, heavy, deliberate. 2 of them. Maybe 3. I could hear the weight of authority in their silence. Not cops, professionals. "Eloan," one called again, his tone colder now. "We just want to talk. You're making this harder than it needs to be." I almost laughed. That's what they said before they buried people's truth. I slipped toward the dock, careful not to make a sound. My father's old rowboat waited there, half covered in moss and memory. I pushed it into the water, the creak of wood echoing like a heartbeat in the fog. Behind me, a flashlight flared. There. By the dock. I jumped in and rowed, muscles burning, breath ragged. The lake stretched wide and endless, a mirror of storm and reflection. Every pull of the oar felt like defiance, like breaking free from every lie he'd told me. "Stop," one of them shouted. A gun cocked. The sound froze me for half a second, then I rowed harder. A shot cracked. The bullet hit the water near my hand, sending up a small explosion of droplets that glittered like shattered glass. I didn't stop. I couldn't. Lightning split the sky. For a moment, I saw the men on shore, their faces ghost pale under the flash, shouting, waving, panicked. They weren't just chasing evidence. They were chasing exposure. I reached the lake's center, where the fog was thickest, and pulled the lockbox to my lap. My father's words echoed, "Protect it." I opened the lid and took a deep breath. The metal was cold, the documents dry. Inside, there was one more thing I hadn't seen before, a small waterproof USB drive, wrapped in tape, labeled, "Send to Federal Records Division. For justice." I whispered, "You planned this, didn't you, Dad?" The flashlight beams started to fade in the distance. The storm swallowed their shouts. And for the first time in years, the lake felt alive again, like it was on my side. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the lake glass still, as if it had witnessed enough. I rowed back to shore, soaked to the bone, but lighter somehow. The lockbox was empty now except for the USB drive. The rest of the files were sealed in waterproof envelopes and hidden deep under the old pier where no one would think to look. Back home, I changed out of my wet clothes and stared at myself in the mirror. My eyes looked older, not from fear, but from seeing too much truth in one night. The house was still chaos, open drawers, half-emptied shelves, his things scattered like the aftermath of a man who'd believed he'd never be caught. I sat at his desk, plugged the USB into his laptop, and watched the files unfold. Videos, recordings, scanned letters, every piece of corruption Alden's company had ever buried. Environmental destruction, falsified permits, quiet bribes. It was all there. My father's voice echoed through one final recording. "If this reaches the public, it means my daughter did what I couldn't. The truth belongs to everyone, Ellie. Don't let them silence the water." Tears blurred my vision. I pressed upload. Within minutes, the files were sent to multiple agencies, media networks, and digital archives. It wasn't revenge, it was release. I sat back and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen like dawn creeping over the horizon. Then, suddenly, my phone vibrated, dozens of notifications. News alerts. Calls from unknown numbers. Major corruption scandal resurfaces, Alden Industries under investigation. Whistleblower evidence leaked online. I closed my eyes. The sound of the lake returned in my memory, soft ripples against the dock, like applause. Then another message came in. From D.T. Rains. Subject: Your husband's confession. Body: His talking. He says he didn't act alone. A chill slid through me. So it wasn't just greed. There was something, or someone, else behind it. I looked out the window toward the fading night. The lake shimmered faintly under the early light, almost as if it were waiting for the ending it deserved. By the time the sun rose, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, investigators, strangers, everyone wanted to talk to the woman who'd leaked the Alden files. But I didn't answer a single call. I just watched the light spill across the lake, turning the mist into gold. A week had passed since that night. Alden Industries was under federal investigation. The company's assets were frozen, and their executives were facing indictments for decades of cover-ups. My father's name, once dragged through mud, was now being spoken on the news with respect. The late Edward Ainsley, the man who tried to warn us. And my husband? He sat in a holding cell, stripped of his watch, his arrogance, his clever smirk. His lawyer reached out, begging me to visit, to help him explain. I didn't go. I'd already heard enough explanations in candlelight. Instead, I went back to the cabin. The air was quiet again, the way my father loved it. The lake reflected the clouds perfectly, no ripples, no lies, just stillness. I knelt by the dock and dropped a single lily into the water. "Dad," I whispered, "I kept it safe. It's yours again." As the flower drifted outward, I caught my reflection beside it, calm, unrecognizable. Not the woman who once trembled under her husband's smirk, but the woman who outweighted him, outthought him, outlived his greed. Behind me, my phone buzzed one last time, a message from the authorities. Subject: property rights restored. Body: the lake is legally yours again. I smiled. Not with triumph, but with peace. Walking back up the path, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of water lapping against the pier, almost like a voice saying thank you. They took my inheritance. They sold my silence. But they forgot one thing my father taught me. Truth doesn't drown. It waits. And when it surfaces, it takes everyone with it. I looked back one last time, the sunlight breaking across the water like justice itself.